The white veil hit the red dirt of Caldwell, Kansas like a surrender flag, and nobody moved to pick it up. It was the summer of 1878, and the heat had a particular cruelty to it that year, the kind that pressed down on a person's shoulders like a hand that wanted to remind them just how small they were beneath the enormous sky. The town of Caldwell sat along the Kisham Trail, a place of cattle drives and dust storms and men with loud ambitions and louder boots, and on this particular Tuesday morning in late July, it had also become the site of the most talked-about humiliation the territory had ever produced. Lillian Hawthorne stood in the doorway of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell in a wedding dress that her mother had saved for 12 years, a gown made of ivory cotton with lace trim along the collar and small pearl buttons running from the nape of her neck to the small of her back. She had 22 years of life behind her, hair the color of dark chestnuts, and eyes so green they made people pause mid-sentence when she looked at them directly. She was, by any measure, a woman a man ought to have been grateful to stand beside. The man who had not been grateful was named Preston Gale. Preston Gale was 31 years old, the son of the wealthiest cattle broker in Sumner County, and he had been courting Lillian for the better part of 2 years. He had brought her wildflowers from the edge of the creek. He had tipped his hat at her father on the porch. He had written her 3 letters when he traveled to Abilene on business, each one full of the kind of promises that a woman reads twice and then folds carefully into the corner of her mirror. He had proposed to her in the spring, under the cottonwood tree near the livery stable, and she had said yes with the full weight of her heart behind the word. She had believed him. That was the thing about Lillian Hawthorne. She was not naive, exactly. She had seen enough of the territory to know that men could be rough and careless. She had watched her father drink himself quiet after the cattle market collapsed 3 years running. She had nursed her mother through a fever that took 6 weeks to break and left the woman half-deaf in her right ear. She was not a girl who floated through life untouched by its difficulties. But she had believed in Preston Gale with a particular and stubborn faith, because she had thought that faith was something a person owed to the person they had chosen. She had been wrong. Preston stood at the altar when she came through the church doors on the arm of her father, and she had seen it in his face before he even opened his mouth. Not love, not even the mild warmth of affection. There was something cold behind his eyes, a settled kind of decision, like a man who has already packed his bags and is simply waiting for a polite moment to leave. The church held 60 people. Every one of them saw what happened next. Preston Gale cleared his throat when Lillian reached the altar. He looked at her father, not at her, and said in a voice so level it was almost bureaucratic, "I have to withdraw my intentions. I am not able to go through with this." Her father, Thomas Hawthorne, a man who had been weathered to something near transparency by years of loss and sun, went very still. The Reverend Simmons opened his mouth and then closed it again. Lillian felt the entire architecture of her life shift sideways. "You said you had money troubles," Preston continued, speaking still to her father as if she were furniture, as if she were already absent from the room. "I have since learned that it is worse than you let on. The land is mortgaged. The herd is gone. I cannot align my family's name with that kind of situation." He said it simply. He said it like a business decision. He said it the way a man cancels a contract with a supplier when the numbers do not add up. Lillian felt her own voice come from somewhere very far away. "Preston." He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that might have been regret if it had tried harder. "I am sorry, Lillian," he said. "I am sure you will understand when you have had time to think on it." She stood there in that church for one long and terrible moment, surrounded by people she had known her whole life, people who were now very carefully looking at the floor, at the ceiling, at the backs of their own hands. She stood there in the dress her mother had saved 12 years for, with the small pearl buttons and the lace collar, and she understood with absolute and crystalline clarity that she was being left, not in private, not with any consideration for her dignity. She was being left in front of 60 people in the middle of a church on what was supposed to be the best day of her life. She did not cry. She would not give him that. She walked back down the aisle with her spine straight and her chin level, and she pushed through the church doors and out into the July heat, and she kept walking. She walked past the people who had gathered outside because word traveled fast in a town like Caldwell. She walked past the row of horses tied to the post outside the general store. She walked past the edge of town, past the last fence post, and then she kept walking south, into the open country, into the flat and relentless land that stretched away from Caldwell toward the Oklahoma border, with nothing but the white dress on her back and a pair of thin church shoes on her feet and absolutely nothing else. The veil fell somewhere in the first 100 yards. She did not stop to pick it up. The land south of Caldwell in those years was not quite desert, but it was not kind either. It was hard country, dry and pale, cut through with ravines and dotted with scrub brush, and the occasional gnarled post oak standing alone like it had forgotten why it was still trying. The summer heat came down from directly overhead, a relentless and unforgiving pressure, and by the time Lillian had walked 2 miles, she had sweat through the back of her dress, and her church shoes had raised a blister on her left heel that made each step a small negotiation. She kept walking anyway. She was not walking to any particular place. She understood this about herself. There was no destination in her mind, no plan forming, no survival strategy clicking into place with practical efficiency. She was walking because the alternative was to stand still and feel the full weight of what had just happened to her, and she was not ready to do that. If she walked, she could stay ahead of it. If she walked, she was in motion, and motion had always felt to her like a form of agency even when it was not. The sun climbed higher and the land became more alien around her. She crossed a dry creek bed and climbed the far bank with her skirts bunched in both hands, and when she reached the top, she could no longer see Caldwell behind her. There was only the sky and the land and the shimmer of heat above the brown grass. She sat down on a flat rock and looked at her hands. There was still rice in the fold of her left sleeve, tucked there from when she had helped Mrs. Albright prepare the small bags for the guests to throw. She had done that yesterday morning, sitting on the Albright porch, laughing about something she could no longer remember. 24 hours ago she had been laughing. She pressed her hands flat against her knees and looked out at the empty horizon. She had nowhere to go. That was the honest truth of her situation. Her father's land was mortgaged, just as Preston had said, and that mortgage was not new information to Lillian herself. She had known about it for a year. But she had believed, with that faithful and stubborn heart of hers, that things would work out, that they would manage, that a life built with Preston would be enough to keep them steady. There was no that anymore. She could not go back to her parents and tell them what had happened. They had been in the church. They had already heard it. Going back meant walking through that town with people watching her from windows and doorways, with the kindness of sympathy which was sometimes harder to bear than cruelty. It meant sitting in the kitchen, while her mother cried quietly, and her father looked at his boots, and it meant being the ruined Hawthorne girl for every morning that followed. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed very carefully. She did not hear the horse until it was close. The sound came to her slowly, the rhythm of hooves on dry ground, unhurried and steady, not the urgent pounding of a man chasing something, but the quiet approach of someone who was simply riding and happened to be riding in her direction. She dropped her hands from her face and turned. He was perhaps a quarter-mile away when she first saw him, a man on a roan horse, moving at an easy walk. He wore a battered brown hat with the brim turned up on one side, a faded chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and canvas work trousers tucked into boots that had seen considerable use. He was not in a hurry. As he drew closer, she could see that he was maybe 28 or 29 years old, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes that were already watching her with an expression of careful attention. Not the wide-eyed curiosity of a man who had spotted something strange, but the measured look of a person who was trying to understand a situation before reacting to it. He stopped his horse about 20 feet from her and held up a hand in greeting. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to vast open spaces. Lillian looked at him with eyes that were very dry and very direct. "Afternoon," she said back. He looked at her, looked at the wedding dress, looked at the empty land behind her, and then looked back at her face. He did not say anything about any of it. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said, because she was too tired and too worn down to say otherwise. He nodded, as if this was a reasonable and expected answer. He swung down from the horse in one smooth motion and walked the animal a few steps closer, stopping when he was close enough to talk without raising his voice but far enough to give her the clear impression that he was not crowding her. "Orville Bristol," he said, touching the brim of his hat. She looked at him for a moment. "Lillian Hawthorne." He nodded again. He reached behind his saddle and unhooked a canteen, held it out toward her. "Water," he said. "You have been walking a ways." She accepted it without ceremony. The water was warm, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank several long swallows and handed it back, and he hooked it back on the saddle without comment. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Nowhere in particular," she said. He looked out at the horizon in the direction she had been walking. It was not a look of concern exactly, more like a quiet calculation. After a moment he said, "There is nothing in that direction for about 40 miles. After that there is a trading post and then Oklahoma territory." "I know," she said. "The temperature out here will hit 105 before evening." "I know that too." He did not argue with her. He did not tell her she was being foolish or hysterical, which was what she had expected, because that was what men generally told women who did things that men did not understand. He simply stood there for a moment, one hand on the pommel of his saddle, looking at the same horizon she was looking at. Then he said, very quietly, "I do not know what happened to you back there. I passed through Caldwell about an hour ago, and the town was in quite a state about something. I heard your name mentioned. I am not the sort of man who rides around collecting other people's business, but I will tell you what I am. I am a man who cannot in good conscience ride away and leave a woman alone in open country with no water and no shade and shoes that look like they were made for a parlor and not for walking the territory." She stared at him. He met her gaze without flinching or apologizing for what he had said. "I am not going back to Caldwell," she said. "I did not say anything about Caldwell," he said. "I have a camp about 3 miles east, near a grove of cottonwoods by Bluff Creek. There is shade and water and a cook fire. You can sit there as long as you need to, and when you decide what you want to do, I will help you do it if I am able. And if you want me to ride away and leave you alone, I will do that too. I just need to hear you say it." She looked at him for a long moment. He was steady in a way that she could not quite name. Not passive, not indifferent, but steady. The kind of steady that comes from a person who has made peace with the fact that the world is not arranged for their convenience and has decided to move through it anyway with their character intact. 3 miles east," she repeated. "Yes." She stood up from the rock, smoothed the skirts of the dress down with her hands, and looked at the roan horse. "I do not ride," she said. "I know," he said, and before she could ask what he meant by that, he added, "You are wearing church shoes. Anyone can see you have not been near horses today." There was something almost gentle in the way he said it, not condescending, just observational. "You can ride the horse," he said. "I will walk. That is your horse. He will not mind carrying a lighter load for a few miles." He looked at the animal, then back at her. "He is well-mannered. His name is Copper." She looked at the roan horse, who was standing with a patience that did seem to confirm the claim of good manners. "All right," she said. He helped her mount without any drama about it, simply cupped his hands for her foot and boosted her up, then adjusted the stirrups with quiet efficiency. He took the reins and walked ahead, leading the horse east, and Lillian sat in the saddle in her wedding dress and watched the back of this man's battered hat moving through the brown grass and tried to figure out what, exactly, she had walked into. The camp by Bluff Creek was simple and orderly. A bedroll set out under the largest cottonwood, a cook fire with a small iron pan and a coffee pot set off to the side, a supply roll tied to a second, smaller tree, and evidence that someone had been here several days. There was a stack of cut firewood and a bucket near the creek. Orville helped her down from the horse with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he seemed to bring to everything, and then he built the fire back up while she sat on a log near the cottonwood and took off the church shoes and looked at the blister on her heel. He noticed without her saying anything. He went to his supply roll and came back with a small tin of something and a piece of clean cloth. "May I?" he said, nodding at her foot. She held it out without particularly thinking about it. He was very careful, cleaning the blister and wrapping the cloth around her heel with a quiet concentration that made the whole thing feel completely ordinary, which was a remarkable achievement given that she was a woman in a wedding dress being tended to by a stranger in a creek camp in the middle of nowhere. "You are a cowhand?" she asked. "I have been," he said. "I am between outfits at the moment. I drove cattle up from Texas with the Harlow outfit this spring, and they paid off in Abilene in June. I have been riding back slow. Back to where? I grew up in the Indian Territory down near the Cimarron. My mother's family had a homestead there." He tied the cloth off neatly. "There is not much left of it now, but I have been thinking about rebuilding." She looked at him. "That is a long way to go slow." For the first time since she had met him, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "I have been stopping where things seemed worth stopping for," he said. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, which was hot and strong and deeply good, and then he went about the business of making camp in a quiet, efficient way that did not demand her attention or her conversation. He saw to the horse, restocked the firewood, and then settled on the far side of the fire with his own cup, and they sat there together in a silence that was, against all logic, not uncomfortable. The sun began its slow fall toward the western horizon, painting the sky above the creek in bands of orange and copper, and Lillian sat with her bare feet on the warm earth and her wedding dress spread out around her on the log, and she let the silence settle into her like something she had been carrying for a long time and was finally allowed to put down. After a while she said, "He left me at the altar." Orville looked at her across the fire. He did not say he was sorry or offer any of the reflexive expressions of consolation that most people would have reached for. He just waited. "He said my father's finances were unsound," she continued, "which they are. He knew that when he proposed to me, or at least he ought to have known. My father has not been prosperous for several years." She turned the cup in her hands. "He decided at the altar that it was not worth it, in front of 60 people. Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was a cowardly thing to do. 2 words, 3 syllables of honest assessment. Something in her chest shifted at that. Not the performative indignation of someone trying to make her feel better. Just a simple, unadorned statement of what it actually was. "Yes," she said. "It was." They ate that evening from his provisions, dried beef and hard biscuits and a tin of peaches that he opened carefully with his knife and shared between 2 tin plates, and they talked a little more and then a little more than that, the way people do when the fire is low and the dark is friendly and there is nothing left to perform for one another. She learned that he had ridden for 4 different outfits in 7 years, that he had been as far north as Colorado and as far south as the Rio Grande, and that he had a habit of reading whatever he could get his hands on, which was why his supply roll contained, alongside the practical necessities, a well-worn copy of a Dickens novel. "You carried that on a cattle drive," she said. "The nights are long," he said simply. She learned that his father had been a horse trader who died of a fever when Orville was 15, and that his mother, a determined woman named Clara, had run the Cimarron homestead alone for 3 years after that before her own health failed. He said all of this without self-pity, as if he were simply reporting facts about the geography of his life. She told him about her mother's deafness and her father's drinking, and about how she had been teaching the younger children at the Caldwell schoolhouse 2 mornings a week for the past year, because she liked the work, and because the small pay helped. She told him about the 12 years her mother had saved for the wedding dress. He listened to every word. By the time the fire had burned to coals, She had been talking to this man for 3 hours, and she felt, which was the most disorienting thing about the entire extraordinary day, entirely and completely at ease. She slept that night in his bedroll, which he offered and she accepted, and he slept on his saddle blanket on the other side of the dead fire with his coat across him. And in the morning she woke to the sound of the creek running and the smell of coffee already on the fire. And for approximately 3 seconds she had forgotten everything, and those 3 seconds were the best 3 seconds she could remember in a very long time. Then she remembered. She sat up and looked at the pearl buttons on the cuffs of the wedding dress and took a very long breath. Orville was crouched by the fire. He looked up when she sat up. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He poured her coffee and said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" she said. "About what is going to happen to you." He said it plainly, not rudely, just directly. "You cannot stay out here indefinitely. You have no provisions, no horse, no money that I know of, and the Caldwell talk will only get worse the longer you are gone. I know you said you do not want to go back." "I said I do not want to go back to Caldwell." "Right. So the question is where you do want to go." He handed her a biscuit. "There are options. Wichita is north about 30 miles. You might find work there. Dodge City is west further, or Indian Territory south." She looked at the fire. "I do not have options that require money I do not have." "I have some," he said, "from the Harlow Drive. I would lend it to you with no expectation of return." She looked at him sharply. He met her eyes without any of the self-congratulation that most men would have loaded into an offer like that. "I am not saying that to make you beholden to me," he said. "I am saying it because you are clearly a capable person who has been put in a bad circumstance that is not of your making, and because I have the means to help and it would cost me nothing that I would notice." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. "You do not know me." He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He did not give her a quick answer. He looked at the creek for a moment, then back at her. "My mother was left in a bad circumstance once," he said. "When my father's first business partner cleared out with half their savings. She was left with 2 children and a failing homestead and the whole territory watching to see what she would do. She told me once that what she remembered most was not the hardship but the way people looked at her, like she had become a problem to be managed instead of a person to be known." He paused. "I swore I would never look at a person like that, and I have tried to keep that." Lillian sat very still. She thought about 60 people looking at her in that church. "Wichita," she said. "Wichita," he repeated. "I can find work as a teacher or a seamstress. I sew well." She set down the coffee cup. "I am not going to take your money as a gift, but I will take it as a loan, and I will write you a note of it and I will repay it." "You do not have to write a note," he said. "I want to write a note," she said firmly. "I want there to be something that is mine to honor." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, steady eyes, and then he said, "All right." He had paper and a pencil in his supply roll, because of course he did. She wrote the note carefully, specifying the amount and the debt, signed it with her full name and folded it and handed it to him. He tucked it in his shirt pocket without reading it. "I will ride with you to Wichita," he said. She looked at him. "That is not necessary." "It is a 2-day ride through open country," he said. "A woman alone in a wedding dress is going to attract the wrong kind of attention." She could not argue with this. She knew it was true. "I have spare clothes in my pack," he added. "They will be too large, but they will be better than the dress for riding." He paused. "If you want them." She looked down at the ivory cotton with the lace trim and the pearl buttons and thought about her mother saving for 12 years. And then she said, "Yes, I want them." The spare clothes were indeed too large, a faded blue work shirt and a pair of canvas trousers that she had to hold up with her belt, but she rolled the sleeves and managed the trousers with a length of rope from his pack, and when she was done she felt, for the first time in 24 hours, something close to herself again. She folded the wedding dress carefully, wrapped it in his oilcloth, and he tied it behind the saddle without being asked. They rode north together, she on copper and he leading from the ground for the first hour until they came across a situation that resolved itself unexpectedly in the form of a stray bay horse, still saddled and bridled, grazing in a dry wash about 4 miles north of the camp. Orville caught the bay easily. They waited for an hour to see if anyone came looking for it, and nobody did. He found no brands on its near side that he could identify, and after a careful inspection declared that the horse was not injured or distressed. "It is either lost or abandoned," he said. "I will report it when we reach Wichita, but in the meantime we cannot leave it out here, and we need 2 horses anyway." This was so practically reasonable that she simply nodded. They rode side by side through the dry Kansas grassland, and the conversations that had started at the campfire the night before continued and deepened, branching into unexpected territories. He told her about the nature of cattle drives, the sheer physical scale of moving 2,000 animals through unfamiliar country, the dust so thick you could not see the lead steer from the drag position, the nights when the herd was restless and you rode slow circles in the dark trying to keep them quiet. He told it without romance but without complaint, just honest description, and she listened with genuine interest. She told him about what it meant to grow up as a girl in Sumner County with aspirations beyond the county line and a society that had very clear and specific ideas about what aspirations were appropriate for a woman. She told him about the books she had read, passed along from the schoolteacher's personal library, and about wanting to learn more than she had been given the opportunity to learn. "You could go to college," he said. She laughed. It came out a little broken, but it was a laugh. "A woman from Caldwell, Kansas in 1878 going to college. It happens," he said. "There are women's colleges. My mother read about one in a newspaper. It costs money," she said. "Those things worth doing cost something," he said, without dismissing the difficulty of what she was saying. They made camp the first night in a shallow valley where another grove of cottonwoods stood near a spring, and over another fire and more of his provisions, the conversation shifted into something quieter and more personal, the way conversations do on the second evening when the novelty has settled, and what is left is the true shape of 2 people becoming known to each other. He told her about loneliness. He said it without drama, matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. He said that 7 years of riding from outfit to outfit had given him a very complete education in the landscape of the American West and a very incomplete experience of belonging anywhere. He said he had begun to understand that belonging was not something that happened to a person, but something a person had to choose, deliberately, even in the face of difficulty, and that he had not yet found the place or the situation where that felt possible. She was quiet after he said this. Then she said, "I thought I had found it. I thought that was what I was choosing when I said yes to Preston." "I know," he said. "I do not think I was wrong to want it," she said, "just wrong about the vehicle." He looked at her across the fire, and something in his expression had shifted slightly, become slightly more open, slightly less guarded. "No," he said, "you were not wrong to want it." She looked back at him for what felt like a long moment before either of them looked away. She slept better that night than she had any right to, given the circumstances. They reached the edge of Wichita on the afternoon of the second day, riding in from the south along the Arkansas River, where the cottonwood grew thick on the bank, and the town rose up ahead of them in the particular rough-edged way that a cattle town of the 1870s presented itself. Wooden storefronts and false fronts, and a main street thick with horses and wagons and men in various states of dusty employment. Wichita in 1878 was no longer quite the wild outpost it had been in the years when the Kishom Trail had run straight through its center, but it was still a working cattle town, and it still had the energy of a place where a person could reinvent themselves if they were willing to work for it. Orville reported the bay horse to the town marshal's office as he had promised, and they ate a real meal at a boarding house on Douglas Avenue, and then they walked together along the main street while Lillian looked at the town and thought about her options. There was a school at the north end of town. She could see the small white building from the main street. There was also, on the south end, a dressmaker's shop with a sign in the window indicating that work was available. She had not expected to feel frightened. She had walked into the desert in a wedding dress and slept 2 nights in the open country with a stranger, and she had not felt particularly frightened. But standing in Wichita looking at her potential future, she felt something grip her chest with both hands and squeeze. Orville was standing beside her, not pressing her, just present in that quiet way he had established as his particular manner. "I need to go speak to someone about work," she said. "I know," he said. She turned to look at him. She had known this man for 2 days. 2 days of walking and riding and sitting by fires and talking in the dark, and she felt, which was alarming, that she knew the shape of him better than she had known Preston Gale after 2 years of careful courtship. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly, dismissing the need. "Do not," he said. "Orville." He looked at her. She was not sure what she had intended to say. She looked at his face, at the steady dark eyes and the weathered jaw and the battered hat, and she was aware of something that had been gathering for 2 days and that she had been carefully not looking at directly, the way you did not look directly at the sun. "Will you be leaving Wichita soon?" she asked instead. He was quiet for a moment. "I had planned to ride south," he said, "back toward the Cimarron." "When?" "I had not fixed a date." She looked at the street. "There is a boarding house on Elm Street," she said. "I saw the sign when we came in. If I am able to find a room, would you be willing to stay in Wichita for a few days, in case I need assistance navigating things?" He looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes, and the slight suggestion of a smile moved across his face again. "I believe I can manage a few days," he said. The dressmaker on the south end of Wichita was a woman named Frances Aldrich, who was about 40 years old, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with the kind of confidence that came from having built something of her own. She looked Lillian up and down when she walked in, taking in the oversized work shirt and the rope-belted trousers and the obvious intelligence in the young woman's face, and said, "What can you do?" Lillian told her. She could sew, had been sewing since she was 8. She could cut patterns, had learned from her mother who had learned from her own mother. She could alter, repair, and finish, and she was quick. Frances nodded. "I have more orders than I can fill," she said. "I have been looking for someone reliable for 2 months. The last girl I hired could not stay past the first week because her family moved on to Colorado. She named a wage. 6 days a week, 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Sundays are your own." The wage was not generous, but it was real and it was honest. Lillian said yes. She walked back to the main street feeling something she had not felt in 2 days: purpose. Clear, practical purpose, the sense of moving toward a life she was constructing with her own hands. Orville was waiting outside the land registry office across the street, which she noticed with a flicker of curiosity. He fell into step beside her when she crossed. "You found work," he said. He could apparently read it in her walk. "I did," she said. "At the dressmaker on the south end." She paused. "What were you doing at the land registry?" He was quiet for a moment. "Looking at some information about property along the Cimarron," he said. "There is a parcel adjacent to my mother's old homestead that has been open for claiming since last year." She looked at him. "You are thinking of going through with it?" "I have been thinking about it for a long time," he said. "Coming through Kansas has made it feel more urgent." She wanted to ask him what specifically about coming through Kansas had made it feel urgent, but she thought she knew, and asking felt like pressing on something that needed more room to breathe. She found a room at the Elm Street boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Cora Park, who charged fair rates and whose house was clean, and who, after one look at Lillian's general circumstances, lent her a dress without being asked and declined to make any comment about the wedding dress wrapped in oilcloth that Lillian carried upstairs. That evening, Lillian and Orville ate supper together at the boarding house table alongside Mrs. Park and 2 other boarders, a land surveyor from Ohio named Harris and a quiet older man named Gant who worked at the railroad yard. It was, by every external measure, an ordinary evening. But Lillian found herself watching the way Orville engaged with people, the way he listened carefully, the way he said thoughtful things when he spoke and did not say things simply to fill silence, and she was aware that this was not an ordinary man. Orville stayed 3 days. In those 3 days he helped her settle into the rhythm of the town, showing her where the markets were, and the post office and the bank, walking with her to the schoolhouse on the second morning when she inquired about tutoring work to supplement the dressmaking wages. He did all of this without directing or managing her, simply accompanying, offering information when it was useful, staying quiet when it was not. On the evening of the 3rd day, they sat on the front steps of the boarding house as the sun went down over the Arkansas River. "I need to start riding south tomorrow," he said. She had known it was coming. She had been bracing against it since the afternoon without admitting that she was doing so. "I know," she said. He looked at the river. "I'm going to file that claim on the Cimarron parcel before the end of the month," he said. "There is a land office in the territory. If the claim goes through, I will have something to build." "It is good country," she said, though she had never been there. "It is hard country," he said, "but good." He paused. "I have been thinking about what you said, about belonging. About choosing it deliberately." She looked at him. He was looking at the river with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his thinking face, careful and inward and very serious. "Lillian," he said. "Yes," she said. He turned and looked at her, and the thing that she had been carefully not looking at directly for 3 days was right there in his face, clear and steady and without artifice. "I know that the timing of this is terrible," he said. "I know that you have been through something that would put anyone off the subject of attachment for a considerable time. I know that I am a man without a fixed home and insufficient everything, and that I have only been acquainted with you for 3 days. He paused. "I am not asking you for anything. I want to be very clear about that. But I would like to write to you if you are willing, and I would like to come back through Wichita in the spring on my way north to file the final paperwork, if you are still here." She looked at him. She was aware of her own heart, which was doing something quite unreasonable. "I am told I write good letters," she said. The near smile appeared, and this time it became an actual smile, brief and warm, and she thought that this was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and that it was worth having waited 3 days for. "I will not pretend that I am not hoping those letters lead somewhere," he said. "But I am asking for nothing, only the letters. Write to me," she said, "and come back in the spring." He rode out the next morning while the air was still cool. She stood on the front step of the boarding house and watched Copper move south down the road until the roan horse was small against the green-gold distance, and then until he was gone. She went inside and started her first day of the rest of her life. The letters began arriving in September, 3 weeks after he left. The first one was short, barely a page, describing the Cimarron country and the state of his mother's old homestead with a factual precision that was somehow more evocative than any flowery language would have been. The house was standing but needed work. The well was good. The land was dry at the moment, but that would change with the fall rains. He had filed the preliminary claim. He enclosed the note she had written him about the loan, with a single line below it that said, "This is canceled. Before you argue, please consider that I took considerable enjoyment from the 3 days in Wichita and consider the matter settled." She sat in her small room at Elm Street and laughed until her eyes watered. She wrote back the same evening, 4 pages, which was twice what she had intended to write. She told him about the dressmaking work, which she had come to genuinely enjoy more than she had expected. She told him about Frances Aldrich, who was turning out to be a remarkably interesting woman with strong opinions about everything from thread quality to territorial politics. She told him about the schoolhouse inquiry, which had produced a part-time tutoring arrangement for 2 afternoons a week with the children of one of the wealthier ranching families in the county, an arrangement that paid better than she had hoped. She told him she was keeping the note. It was her right to honor a debt, and she intended to honor it, and if he insisted on canceling it, she was simply going to write another one for the same amount, and he could do what he liked with that one. His next letter arrived 2 weeks later, 8 pages. She read it twice. The correspondence that built over the fall of 1878 and into the winter was not the formal, carefully restrained letter writing of two people who were aware of being observed. It was the kind of writing that happens when two people discover that they are capable of genuine intellectual intimacy, where one thought leads to another and another, where the conversation moves from the practical to the philosophical and back again, with the ease of people who have found a matching frequency. He wrote about the homestead, the daily work of rebuilding a structure that had been sitting empty and deteriorating for 4 years, the physical particularity of it, the smell of fresh-cut wood, and the sound of wind through gaps in the walls that he was steadily sealing. He wrote about the land itself with a descriptive care that was almost poetic without being self-conscious about it. The way the light came across the Cimarron at dawn, the specific color of the grass in November, the distant sound of cattle from a neighbor's range that felt like company without requiring anything. She wrote about the town, about the particular texture of Wichita in the fall and winter of 1878, the way the cattle trade slowed, and the town took on a different character, quieter and more domestic, the ranching families coming in for supplies and the merchants adjusting their rhythms. She wrote about her students, 2 children named Edmund and Clara whose capacity for learning was remarkable and whose capacity for sitting still was considerably more limited. She wrote about Francis Aldrich's opinion of the territorial government, which was extensive and unsparing, and which Lillian found increasingly difficult to disagree with. She wrote about her parents. She had written to them in September, a careful letter that said she was well and working and building something, and her mother had written back with a letter that was half relief and half grief and entirely loving. Her father had added 3 lines at the bottom in his unsteady hand, saying he was sorry and that he was proud of her, and that the wedding dress was safe. She cried when she read those 3 lines. Then she wrote back and told them she was all right. The first snowfall came in late November, and with the snow came a longer letter from Orville than any previous one, which was saying something. He wrote about the homestead's progress, the repairs nearly complete, the work on a small corral, the acquisition of 2 young horses from a neighboring ranch. He wrote about what he was planning to plant in the spring, practical and specific, corn and kitchen garden and hay for the horses. He wrote about what a life in that place might look like, not grandly but carefully, considering each piece of it. And then, at the end of a long paragraph about the water quality of the Cimarron tributary that ran along the southern edge of the property, he wrote, "I do not want to build this only for myself. I have been building it and thinking about it, and I find that the thinking keeps arriving at the same place, which is that what I am working toward has a shape that is not the shape of a single person's life. I am aware that this is something I am telling you in a letter, which is not how I would prefer to say it. I would prefer to say it in person. I intend to be in Wichita before the spring. I will understand entirely if you have determined that what has formed between us through these letters is primarily epistolary in nature and does not translate to other things. But I would like the chance to find out." She read that paragraph 4 times. Then she sat down and wrote back a letter of exactly 2 sentences. "Come to Wichita, Orville. I will be waiting." He arrived in the 3rd week of February, 1879, riding into Wichita on a cold, gray afternoon with Copper and the second horse he had acquired, a sturdy brown gelding that he had named something she could not catch the first time. She was at the dressmaker's shop when Mrs. Park sent word that there was a man at the boarding house asking for her, and she walked the 4 blocks from the shop with her coat pulled tight and her heart doing the unreasonable thing again. He was standing outside the boarding house in the same battered brown hat and the faded chambray shirt under a heavier coat, and he looked exactly as she remembered him, which she had been afraid he might not. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "Lillian." And she said, "Orville." And then, because she had been writing letters to this man for 5 months, and because she was done being careful about certain things, She closed the remaining distance between them and took both his hands in hers. He was very still for a moment. Then his hands closed around hers, warm and careful and firm. "I have things to say," he said, "that I have been practicing." "You practiced," she said. 3 weeks, he said, with the near smile becoming the full smile which was still worth whatever weight was attached to it. She laughed. "Say them then." He looked at her, and what was in his face was not practiced at all. It was entirely and completely real. "I rode after you because I could not leave a person in the desert alone," he said. "That is true. But somewhere between the Cottonwood camp and Wichita, I understood that I was not riding after a person in difficulty. I was riding after you. You specifically, and I have been heading back toward you ever since." She felt something that had been tight in her chest for a very long time loosen and release. "I am not Preston Gale," he said. "I want to say that clearly because I know what happened at that church, and I know that trust is something that has to be rebuilt carefully, and I am not asking you to give me trust you have not yet determined I have earned. I am asking you to give us time to build something together, and to let me show you what I mean." She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she had been reading letters from all winter. At the man who had given her water in the desert and his bedroll and his savings, and 3 days of the most uncomplicated and genuine companionship she had ever experienced. At the man whose letters had made her laugh and think and feel more like herself than she had felt in years. "You already have it," she said. "You have had it since the second morning at the creek when you made coffee before I woke up." He looked at her with those eyes, and she thought she might very well be in significant trouble, in the best possible way. That evening they sat in the parlor of Mrs. Park's boarding house, which Mrs. Park vacated with transparent and entirely welcome tact, and they talked for 3 hours about the Cimarron homestead in Wichita and what a shared life might look like, with the particular specificity of 2 people who had been corresponding about practical things for months, and who understood each other's way of thinking. He was not a man who rushed. He made this clear. He said that the homestead needed another season of work before it was ready to be anyone's permanent home, and that he wanted to return to the territory and finish what he had started and have a real and properly prepared place to bring a person to. He said this not as a delay tactic but as a statement of intention, the clear declaration of a man who intended to do things right. She told him that she intended to stay in Wichita through the spring at minimum, that she had made a commitment to Frances Aldrich and to her students, and that she honored her commitments. She said this knowing he would understand it, because he was the kind of person who understood it. He stayed in Wichita for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks they walked the length of Douglas Avenue in the February cold and ate meals at the boarding house table, and argued companionably about the Dickens novel he had finished, and the one he was now working through, and he came to the dressmaker's shop and met Frances Aldrich, who looked him over with the sharp eye she brought to everything, and said to Lillian afterward, "He is a straight-backed man. Those are rare." They did not speak again about love in those explicit terms, but they lived next to it easily, the way people do when the feeling is settled, and what is required now is the work of building toward it. He rode south in the second week of March, and before he left, standing again outside the boarding house, he took off his hat and looked at her with a directness that made the gray February sky seem incidental. "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not today. When I have the homestead ready and when you are ready, and when we have had enough time in each other's company that you are absolutely certain and I am absolutely certain. I am telling you now because I do not want there to be any ambiguity about what I am building toward." She looked at him. "There is no ambiguity," she said. He put his hat back on. "Good," he said. She reached up and adjusted the brim of it, which was slightly wrong from being taken off, and he went very still at the contact, and then smiled, which was its own answer to a question neither of them had asked out loud. "Write to me," she said. "Every week," he said. He rode south, and the letters came every week, and the spring of 1879 built itself up around Lillian Hawthorne in Wichita, Kansas, with a feeling entirely different from the previous year. She was not waiting for her life to begin. She was living it. The dressmaking work had expanded, and she had taken on an additional student at the schoolhouse, a quiet and remarkable girl named Bessie who could read at a level that suggested she ought to have been sent east for proper education. And Lillian wrote long letters to Orville about this, and about the injustice of a world that arranged access to education so entirely according to the accident of birth. He wrote back pages about this topic. He had strong views about it, shaped by his own experience of learning things piecemeal, by firelight and in the margins of working days, and about the way the territorial West produced people of considerable capability who were then systematically denied the structures that would have allowed that capability to develop fully. He wrote about this with the controlled passion of someone who had thought about it a great deal and who understood the cost of it personally. She loved him for this. She knew it clearly by April. He came back to Wichita in May, and the homestead was in his voice when he arrived, the satisfaction of a thing built with one's own hands present in the way he moved, and the particular confidence of a man who has done what he set out to do. The house was repaired. The corral was complete. The kitchen garden was planted. The spring rains had been good. They rode together out of Wichita for 2 days, heading south along the Arkansas River, camping in the familiar way that felt completely natural to both of them now. And in the evenings, they talked about the future with the easy specificity of two people who have already agreed on the direction and are now only working out the details. On the second evening, sitting by the fire with the spring stars enormous above them, he reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and set it on the flat rock between them. It was a ring, simple, silver, made with obvious care. "I had it made by the silversmith in the territory," he said. "I did not know your size, so I had him make it adjustable, which he thought was very practical and also slightly unromantic, and he told me so at considerable length." He paused. He was probably right about the unromantic part. I was trying to be practical. She was looking at the ring. "I think practical is romantic," she said, "in the context of wanting it to actually fit." "I hoped you would think something like that," he said. He looked at her. "Lillian Hawthorne, I would like to spend my life with you. I would like to build the Cimarron homestead into something worth passing on. I would like to read books with you and argue about them and listen to you talk about your students and watch you become every version of yourself that you have not yet had room to become." He paused, and there was something in his face that was very open and very honest and completely without armor. "I love you. I have loved you since the Creek camp, I think, though I did not have the language for it at the time." She looked at him across the fire, and she thought about the desert and the white veil on the red dirt, and the 60 people in the church who had watched her become undone, and the long walk into the open country that had felt like the end of everything and had turned out to be the beginning. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, clearly and completely. "I will marry you, Orville Bristol, and I will go to the Cimarron with you and build something worth building. And I love you too. I have since approximately the second letter, though I did not want to say so in case it alarmed you." He reached across and picked up the ring and took her left hand carefully in his right, and he put it on her finger, and it fit nearly perfectly, which said something about the silversmith and also about the effort Orville had made. They sat there by the fire with the spring stars overhead and the Arkansas River sound in the dark and her hand in his, and it was nothing like the altar at the First Baptist Church of Caldwell with 60 people watching. It was entirely private and entirely theirs. They were married in June of 1879 at the courthouse in Wichita, with Frances Aldrich as witness and Mrs. Cora Park in her good hat providing the second witness, and a small collection of the boarding house regulars who had apparently become invested in the outcome of this particular story over the preceding months. The surveyor Harris shook Orville's hand very earnestly and said something about the young people having good sense, which was kind if not entirely accurate regarding the specific circumstances. Her parents came from Caldwell for the ceremony. Her father, Thomas Hawthorne, walked her into the courthouse with a steadiness that had not been present at the church the previous summer, as if he had put down something heavy between then and now. He shook Orville's hand and looked at him with a long, measuring gaze, and apparently found what he was looking for, because he said, "You are a man who rides after people," which was not what most fathers said, but Orville understood it completely. Her mother, Margaret Hawthorne, held Lillian's face in both hands before the ceremony and looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who knows what things have cost and what they are worth, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. There was no white dress. Lillian wore a pale blue dress that she had made herself, from fabric she had chosen, fitted precisely to her own measurements. It had no lace trim and no pearl buttons. It had clean lines and good seams and a small embroidered detail at the collar that she had added because she wanted to, not because convention required it. She thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. After the brief ceremony and a meal at the best restaurant Wichita had to offer, which was a modest qualifier but the food was genuinely good, they loaded their belongings onto the 2 horses and a small mule Orville had acquired for supplies, and they pointed south toward the Indian Territory and the Cimarron River. Her parents stood on the road watching them go, and her mother raised a hand and Lillian raised a hand back, and then Wichita was behind them and the land opened up ahead, familiar and enormous and full of light. She reached across and found his hand on the pommel of his saddle. He laced his fingers through hers. They rode like that, hand in hand on their horses, through the June afternoon. The Cimarron homestead was everything he had described in the letters and more, which was not usually how descriptions and realities related to each other. The house was small but solid, set back from the creek in the shade of 3 large cottonwoods, with a porch that faced east and caught the morning sun. The kitchen garden was already producing in the late summer heat, neat rows of corn and beans and squash that Orville had planted months ago with the particular faith of someone who is not certain he will be alone when it is time to harvest. He had not been alone when it was time to harvest. She stood on the porch the first morning, with the coffee he had made before she woke up, which he was apparently going to continue doing for the rest of her life, and looked out at the Cimarron country spreading away in every direction, the pale grass and the dark ribbon of the river, and the enormous Kansas Territory sky. She thought about the woman who had walked into the desert in a wedding dress with nothing. She thought about what nothing had become. The territory was not without its difficulties, and Lillian was honest enough with herself not to pretend otherwise. The land was hard and the work was constant, and the distances between neighbors meant that a bad situation could become a dangerous one before help arrived. The territorial politics were complicated and often unjust, particularly regarding the native peoples of the region, whose lands had been steadily reduced by agreements that were not fairly made, and whose presence in the country around the Cimarron homestead was a reminder that the land Orville had claimed had a history that preceded him by generations. Orville was not oblivious to this. He made a point of engaging with the neighboring Chickasaw families in the area with respect and directness, learning names and situations, and over time, he developed the kind of working relationships with several families that were built on genuine mutual regard rather than the convenient transaction of proximity. Lillian, who had strong feelings about the injustice of how the territorial system worked, found that she was able to do concrete small things through these relationships, particularly around education, helping with reading lessons and letter writing for several families whose children had limited access to schooling. Frances Aldrich wrote from Wichita with a regularity that Lillian had not expected, but was deeply grateful for. The letters were full of the kind of sharp commentary that Lillian had come to think of as Frances's particular brand of warmth, observations about the town, complaints about fabric suppliers, and occasional direct inquiries about how marriage suited Lillian, phrased in Frances's characteristic way, which was to ask a direct question, and then say she did not really need an answer if it would embarrass anyone. Lillian answered honestly. Marriage to Orville suited her extremely well, she wrote. She included specific evidence, which she suspected Francis would appreciate more than general declarations. The specific evidence included the fact that he still made coffee before she woke up, that he listened to everything she said with the same attention he had shown in the desert, that he was genuinely funny in the quiet, understated way she had first noticed at the campfire, and that they had discovered a capacity for disagreement that was productive rather than corrosive, because both of them had learned to value truth over comfort. Francis wrote back, "You have described what most people spend their whole lives looking for and few of them find. I am glad you found it in the desert. I always thought good things came from inconvenient places. The first year on the Cimarron was full and hard and satisfying in a way that went all the way down to the bone. Orville expanded the corral and began breaking young horses, which was work he was excellent at and which produced reliable income as the territory's horse market was always active. Lillian's sewing skills, which she had thought might become secondary in the territory, turned out to be in high demand among the neighboring families for miles in every direction, and she found herself with more work than she could comfortably take on, and the pleasant problem of deciding what to accept. In the second year, in the spring of 1880, Lillian discovered she was expecting a child. She told Orville on an evening in March when the weather had turned warm enough to sit on the porch again after winter, and she told him simply and directly, the way she had learned they both preferred to tell each other important things. He went very still, which was his way when something was affecting him profoundly. Then he turned to look at her, and his face had something in it that she had never seen there before, a kind of unguarded astonishment, as if the world had done something he had not quite believed it was capable of doing for him. "Lillian," he said. "Yes," she said. "Sometime in the fall, I believe." He reached out and put his hand against her face, and she turned into it, and they sat on the porch in the March twilight saying nothing for a long time, because nothing was necessary. Their son was born in October of 1880, during a week of extraordinary autumn weather when the Cimarron ran bright under a cloudless sky, and the cottonwoods had turned a gold so vivid it looked painted. The birth was attended by a woman named Abigail Doss, who was the nearest midwife and who had helped bring approximately 40 children into the territory in the past decade, and who arrived at the homestead with a calm efficiency that was the most reassuring thing Lillian had ever witnessed. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Orville spent 12 hours outside on the porch because that was where Abigail put him, and Lillian was told afterward that he had worn a visible path in the porch boards by morning. When Abigail finally brought him in and put his son in his arms, he stood there in the kitchen light looking down at the child with an expression that Lillian, watching from the bed, thought was the most complete thing she had ever seen on a human face. They named him Thomas William Bristol, Thomas for her father and William for Orville's, two men who had loved imperfectly and been loved anyway. Thomas was a serious baby, which surprised no one who knew his father, and an observant one, which surprised no one who knew his mother. He looked at everything with a concentrated attention that made visitors feel slightly assessed, which Abigail Doss said was a sign of strong intelligence, and which Orville said was simply his natural inheritance from both sides. Lillian's parents came to see Thomas that winter, making the journey south from Caldwell in a way that told her something important about how her father's situation had changed. He was quieter in his drinking now, and more present in all the ways that mattered, and he held his grandson with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Her mother held the baby and looked at Lillian over Thomas's head with those eyes that said everything, and Lillian reached across and squeezed her mother's hand, and they sat together in the kitchen of the Cimarron homestead while the winter wind came off the river, and the fire was warm, and the baby made the small, contented sounds of a new person who has not yet learned that the world contains difficulty. Preston Gale's name came up exactly once in those years. They were in Wichita for supplies in the summer of 1881, Thomas in his second year, and riding on copper in front of his father with total confidence and zero fear. And they ran into a man who had known Lillian in Caldwell, and who mentioned in passing that Preston had married the daughter of a grain merchant in the spring, and that the new wife's family's money was apparently sufficient to meet his requirements. Lillian noted this information with the equanimity of a person who has genuinely moved on, which was to say she felt nothing except a brief and passing awareness that the chapter had a period at the end of it, and she was glad. Orville asked later if she was all right. "Completely," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her with a slight expression of puzzlement. "Me. You have feelings about things that affect me," she said. "I have noticed this." He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything. "I am all right," he said. "I think the most honest thing I can say is that I am grateful to Preston Gale in a way I suspect neither of us expected." She looked at him. "If he had not done what he did," he said, "you would not have walked out of that church. And if you had not walked out of that church, you would not have been in the desert. And if you had not been in the desert, I would have ridden past Caldwell without stopping and gone straight back to the Cimarron and been alone there, and none of this would exist." He looked at Thomas, who was examining a post at the hitching rail with total concentration. "I cannot be sorry about the existence of any of this." She reached over and took his arm. "No," she said. "Neither can I." They added to the homestead steadily over the following years. A second room to the house in 1882, when it became clear that Thomas's monopoly on the single bedroom could not continue indefinitely. A root cellar in the fall of that year, which proved its worth almost immediately when a winter storm cut them off from town for 2 weeks. A smokehouse in 1883. Orville's horse-breaking business grew into something genuine and respected throughout the territory, and by 1883 he was training horses for 3 of the larger ranching operations in the surrounding counties, riding out for weeks at a time, while Lillian managed the homestead with the competence she brought to everything. They had developed the particular and valuable habit of a marriage where 2 people trusted each other absolutely to do what was needed, which meant that her competence was never doubted and his was never undermined. Frances Aldrich came to visit in the summer of 1883, making the trip from Wichita with the kind of determination that had always characterized her, and she spent 2 weeks on the Cimarron homestead, alternating between admiring everything and offering pointed suggestions for improvement. She and Lillian sewed together in the evenings on the porch, and Orville sat with them sometimes and read, and it was, Frances said, the most peaceful 2 weeks she had had in 10 years. She looked at the homestead when she was leaving, the house and the corral and the garden and the cottonwoods along the creek, and then she looked at Lillian and she said, "You built a good life here." "We built it," Lillian said. "Yes," Frances said. "That is the point." In the fall of 1883 their daughter was born, another long labor and another profound autumn, the territory doing its particular thing with color and light. They named her Clara Margaret, Clara for Orville's mother and Margaret for Lillian's, the 2 women who had given them the particular qualities that had made this life possible. Clara was entirely different from Thomas, which was one of the endlessly interesting things about children. Where Thomas was quiet and concentrated and internally focused, Clara was extravagant in her emotions and her curiosity and her conviction that everything in the world was directly and personally fascinating. She talked at 12 months, in short, determined sentences that left both parents laughing at the kitchen table. Thomas, at 3, regarded his sister with the patient attention of someone who has been assigned a long-term project of great complexity. The homestead in those years had the quality of a place that is completely itself, not aspiring to be anything other than what it was, but deeply and thoroughly realized. The kitchen garden was extensive and productive. The horses in the corral were always worth looking at. The house had accumulated the evidence of years of living in it, the worn spot on the kitchen table where everyone sat to read, the mark on the doorframe where Thomas's height was measured each birthday, the shelf of books that had grown from one battered Dickens novel to a small library that included, on prominent display, the complete works of several authors Lillian had introduced to the household. She had begun teaching again, formally, in 1882. There was no school in the immediate vicinity of the homestead, which meant that the children of several neighboring families had no access to education, and this was a situation Lillian found impossible to continue observing without acting on. She organized a schoolroom in the homestead's new second room 2 mornings a week, and then 3, and then 4, and within a year there were 9 children coming to the Cimarron schoolroom, ranging from 6 to 12 years old. Orville built benches. He built them carefully and without complaint, and he brought them in from the barn one morning and set them in the room and said nothing about the weeks of work they had required, and she looked at him standing in the schoolroom with sawdust on his shirt and said, "You built benches." 9 children is too many to sit on the floor, he said. "You built 9 children's worth of benches," she said. He looked at her with those steady eyes and that near smile. "I was thinking we might need more room next year," he said. "I measured for 12. She crossed the room and put her arms around him and her face against the sawdust smell of his shirt, and he put his arms around her and held her in the quiet of the schoolroom he had just furnished for her. And she thought that this was what love actually looked like when you took the courtship ceremony away and let it be what it really was. A man building benches because the thing that mattered to her mattered to him, and that being enough, that being more than enough, that being everything. The benches were full by the following spring, and Lillian wrote to the county seat about the possibility of official school designation, which would bring funding and materials, and she wrote the letter with the clear and passionate directness that had always been her way, and it worked. The Cimarron schoolroom became the Cimarron School in 1884, with an official designation and a small allocation for materials and a letter from the county official that acknowledged, in bureaucratic language, that what Lillian had built in that room was a genuine educational institution. She read the letter to Orville over supper, and Thomas, now 4, listened with serious attention, and Clara, at 1, ate her supper with the cheerful indifference of someone whose enthusiasm for food currently exceeded her interest in institutional politics. "Congratulations," Orville said when she finished reading. "To us," she said. "This is ours." "It is yours," he said. "I built benches, you built the rest." She looked at him. "Orville." "I am serious," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was. "I want you to know that I know what you have done here, not just the school, all of it. Coming out here and building this life and raising these children and making this place what it is." He paused. "I knew in the desert that you were someone extraordinary. I have had 5 years to find out how right I was." Thomas looked up from his supper. "Is Mama extraordinary?" he asked with the pragmatic curiosity of a 4-year-old. "Very," Orville said. Thomas considered this. "She made the apple pie," he said, which appeared to constitute corroborating evidence. Lillian laughed until she cried, which was a thing that happened regularly in that kitchen, and which was her favorite of all the things that happened there. Her father passed in the winter of 1885, quietly and at home, with her mother beside him. Lillian had visited Caldwell in the fall and had held his hand on the porch while the evening came down, and he had looked at her with the clear eyes of a man who had put down everything heavy and had had a little time to rest before the end. He told her he was proud of her. He told her that the man she had married was the best kind of man, which was the kind who was not interested in telling other people what the best kind was. She carried this with her back to the Cimarron, and she wrote it down in the journal she kept, because she did not want to lose the exact shape of it. Her mother came to live at the homestead after Thomas Hawthorne's passing. Margaret Hawthorne, at 62, was still a sharp-eyed and purposeful woman, though the deafness in her right ear had progressed to both ears now, and communication required patience and directness. She adapted to the homestead with the practicality of a woman who had spent her life adapting to circumstances, and she became, within a season, a central and deeply loved presence in the household. She and Thomas had a relationship that was immediately and completely mutual, two serious, observant people who suited each other perfectly. He would sit with his grandmother for hours, showing her things and receiving instruction in return, and she taught him everything she knew about kitchen gardening with a thoroughness that was, in its way, an education in itself. Clara, who was 2 when her grandmother arrived, treated Margaret Hawthorne as both a resource and an audience, which the older woman seemed to find entirely acceptable. The homestead had by 1886 become something that could legitimately be called a community anchor. The school had grown to 14 students. Orville's horse operation employed 2 seasonal hands. The neighbors who came and went through the property for various purposes had accumulated into something like a network, people who knew they could rely on the Bristols and who extended that reliance in kind. Lillian looked out from the porch one evening in the fall of 1886 and watched Orville working in the corral with a young horse, the particular focused patience of that work visible in his posture and his movements, the way he let the animal understand rather than forcing it to comply. And she thought about the man who had ridden up to her on a flat rock in the desert 8 years ago with a canteen and a willingness to wait for her to tell him what she needed. She thought about what he had said in front of the boarding house in Wichita before she had come back in from the cold. "I am not the man who sent you away." She had understood, when he said it, that he was simply distinguishing himself from Preston Gale. But standing on this porch 8 years later, watching him in the corral in the falling evening light, she understood something more complete about what that sentence had meant. He had said it as a declaration of what he was not, but what he had spent 8 years proving, patiently and fully, and with every coffee made before she woke and every bench built and every letter written and every mile ridden south and back again, was what he was. A man who stayed, a man who built things, a man who listened and adapted and did not require her to be smaller so that he could feel large. A man who loved her the way love actually needed to be practiced in real life, not as a feeling that excused behavior, but as a decision enacted in 1,000 small and particular ways, every day. Thomas had come to the fence to watch his father work with the horse, and Clara had come out of the house to stand beside Lillian on the porch, pressing her warm 3-year-old weight against Lillian's leg, and Margaret Hawthorne was visible through the kitchen window, her head bent over something at the table, the warm lamp light around her. Lillian put her hand on Clara's hair. Orville looked up from the corral and saw her on the porch and raised one hand, and she raised hers back. It was nothing. It was a wave between 2 people who could see each other across a yard. It was the smallest possible gesture. It was the most complete thing she had ever seen. She thought about the white veil on the red dirt of Caldwell. She thought about the blister on her left heel and the canteen in a stranger's hand, and the coffee at the campfire in the first pale morning after everything had ended and everything had begun. She thought about what nothing could become if you were brave enough to walk into it. The territory evening was coming down in its particular way, the sky going from blue to gold to something that was not quite either, the air carrying the smell of the creek and the horses, and the turned earth of the kitchen garden that would need to be put to bed for winter soon. Thomas called something to his father from the fence and Orville answered, and Clara said something indistinct against Lillian's leg that might have been hungry or might have been horsey. It was often one or the other. Orville came out of the corral and crossed the yard, and when he reached the porch he came up the 2 steps and stood beside her and looked out at the evening the way they both liked to do, side by side in the particular companionship of 2 people who had grown so accustomed to each other's presence that they carried each other with them even when they were apart. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into it. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he agreed. Clara reached up and took her father's free hand. Thomas appeared at the porch steps and went inside, heading for the kitchen with the directness of a child who has heard the word hungry from his sister and decided that this is, in fact, also his position. Margaret's head lifted slightly through the window, registering the sound of footsteps. The evening star appeared above the cottonwoods. This was it. This was the thing itself. Not the wedding and not the proposal and not the dramatic night in the desert, though all of those were part of the story and always would be. But this, a porch in the territory evening with the people they loved inside and around them, the work honest and the future open, and the love not a feeling that ebbed and rose with circumstance, but something built into the structure of things, as reliable as the water in the Cimarron, and as enduring as the cottonwoods that had shaded them since the first morning. A disgraced bride had walked into the desert with nothing. She had walked out with everything. And the cowboy who had ridden after her, who had pressed a canteen into her shaking hands and looked at her like she was a person to be known, and not a problem to be managed, who had given her his bedroll and his savings and his letters and his heart, stood beside her now on the porch of the home they had built together, with their children's voices in the kitchen and the stars coming out above the territory. And he held her close in the way of a man who intends to keep holding on. And she held him back with the same intention, and the evening came down full and warm and quietly, gloriously, completely good.